We have another presentation here from the Old Testament. We're going to be exploring the myths of the Old Testament and see what the deeper meaning. And this week we're doing Cain and Abel. We've just had the reading, so let's go through the deeper meaning of Cain and Abel. And if we go to the next slide. So the big picture, this myth, as you will see as we go through step by step, marks a next level of the evolution of humanity in a spiritual sense. So last week, we did Adam and Eve. This is another evolution of humanity that we're going to be talking about. Okay, next slide, please. And just to recap on the story, Cain and Abel are basically, Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. They have two boys, Cain and Abel. These two boys have different skill sets. Abel kept the flocks, and actually Cain grew the crops. They each presented offerings to God for what they did. But God liked Abel's, but he didn't like Cain. So God liked the flocks when they were sacrificed, but he did not like the crops when they were sacrificed. So there's obviously a deep spiritual meaning to this, which we will get to. But as the story continues, if you go to the next slide. Cain is furious and jealous at Abel because he gets all this attention from God. He takes him out to a field and he kills Abel. Next slide, please. And God comes looking for Abel and Cain, and obviously Abel's been murdered. So God asks him, where's your brother? And Cain responds very famously, a very famous quote. If you've never read the Bible, you've heard this. And says, am I my brother's keeper? So he pretends like he doesn't really know where he is. I don't know. Am I supposed to keep track of him? You didn't tell me that. So the story continues. And then God, of course, knows it was Cain and puts a curse on Cain. I found this image, if you can see it, of what supposedly the curse looked like. I don't know if that's it, but there was some sort of protection put on Cain, and it wasn't a literal story, so there wasn't a literal mark. But that's where the phrase you also will hear if you've never read the Bible, you've got the mark of Cain on you. And you might have also heard the expression, he's raising Cain, when someone's doing something really terrible. So it has a lot of common uses in our language. Next slide, please. And so Cain is banished. He's got this protection of a mark on him, so nobody will kill him. And he has a son named Enoch from his wife. And of course, if you were asked, if this is a literal story, you'd say, where'd the wife come from? This is the two kids of Adam and Eve. So that's why we don't take it literally. It's a spiritual story. And he builds a city. Next slide. And at the very end of the show, Adam and Eve, remember them? They make a cameo return appearance at the last episode. And they have another child, Seth. And Seth is born to replace the death of Abel. And that's pretty much the story. So when we look at this from a spiritual or deeper meaning, we're going to try to figure out what is this possibly teaching us. It's clearly not a literal story, though many religions do think it's literal. That's not correct. The true deeper meaning is that Cain represents wisdom and Abel represents kindness. And then the story will make sense. Okay. So Adam and Eve represented the first epoch of human history. If you remember, you can see the video of it if you didn't watch. But they were directly connected with God. Humanity was directly connected with God. It moved in the direction of free will, and it chose evil, and then it was cast out of the garden. So now there are kids, which represent another generation. Cain and Abel mark another evolution of spiritual evolution for humanity. And quite frankly, for humanity, it's not going very well. We got kicked out of the garden, and now we have two kids, and one kills the other. So we're kind of spiraling down as a species in the history of evolution. But that's what happens. We have the murder. And the next evolution, which we'll explain. So God is possessed of two really guiding principles. You'll hear these as love and wisdom, or love and truth, or compassion and truth. Today, I'm going to refer to them as kindness and truth. And they work really well together. They are important to be together. they do not work well apart. So when you have love without truth, it's not great. When you have truth without love, it's not great. So these two brothers mythologically represent those two concepts of sort of kindness and truth. It's very important in this relationship that kindness or love, it must be dominant, and truth has to follow it. You can't start with truth and move to love. You must start with love, and that's a key element of the story. Next slide. So after the humanity has no direct connection to spiritual teachings anymore, how can humanity know how to behave? And so God allows for humanity to create religion and create sacred text and things that can be passed on generation to generation so that they'll know what to do, which is right. In the earlier times, they knew it automatically. Now they've got to figure it out. And so religion is organized as a way of passing down sacred teachings from generation to generation, so we don't have to learn it every generation. And so that is what's going on in this period of Cain and Abel. We're at the beginning of organized religion. Next slide, please. And this is, so we get to that strange story of the altar. Why does God prefer Abel's offering of the flock and he doesn't like Cain's offering of the field? It's the point of that symbolically is that God says that you must start with love. Love is more important than truth. Love is more important than wisdom. In anything that happens in our life, love must come first. We have to start with love. And that's what God is love. So Cain, representing wisdom, he marks organized religion and the focusing on the rules and the doctrines and the truths of life. And when he kills Abel, that represents that humanity automatically over a period of time turned religion into something that killed off love. So what that means is that religion and organized thought around these things, eventually the people who got into it got really into the teachings and the doctrines, and they started excluding people. They started punishing people who weren't like them. And essentially they killed off love. And the whole point of faith, of teaching, spiritual teaching, is to love more, is to be kinder. That's the whole point. So if it gets into a rules-based system where this is my doctrine and you don't get it, and you're outside and I'm inside. If you've heard the kind of like, I'm saved, you're not saved, that's in a nutshell where you're dominated by your doctrine and your teachings and your thing and your truth, but you're not really dominated by love. And that's what the murder represents in the history of the world. So when he says, am I my brother's keeper? It represents that when you have religions and rules without compassion, you really don't care about others. And this leads to a contempt that people have who are religious or in any, this represents religion, but people who think they know the truth and they feel they're superior to others. As we'll see later, it's not just in religion, but it's any time that we have contempt for other people because we feel we're superior. And so this mark of Cain, what does that represent? Well, God is basically saying, I'm going to protect within Cain, within religion, I'm going to protect it because there's a truth in it. There's a truth that can be passed on generation to generation. But it's not, I'm going to control it. It's not going to, I'm going to keep an eye on it. It's not going to dominate. But that's the mark of Cain. Religion does continue in the world. Next slide, please. And the wandering of humanity is the struggle that people will have in our lives, how we'll do good, how we spend our days. It means that for the rest of history, people will have to figure out what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do on a regular basis, 100 times a day. It won't be clear to us. It'll be a struggle to know what's true and what's not true, including what religion to follow and what religious teacher to follow and what faith and all those kind of things. It's very complicated, and we know that many times you can be many people are led by false teachers. Next, please. So this is Enoch. Unfortunately, it runs over a little bit on the slide here, but Enoch, so Cain has a son, he has a wife, she comes out of nowhere. They have a son named Enoch, and they build a city. This represents humanity starting to build in their mind that they have all the answers, they have the truth, that they don't need anything but God. So it's building the city means building constructs in our own head. Next slide. Seth is interesting. The very end, I mentioned that cameo appearance where you have Adam and Eve and then Seth is born. So Seth represents a replacement for Abel in the world. And it means that God is always going to send out a remnant throughout every epoch of history, people who will understand that God is love, and that love is the most important thing, and truth follows. That will always be a protected community, but he describes it it's described like a remnant. It's a smaller group. And so I think we shouldn't be surprised when we say, look at world religions and the intolerance of religion generally, or the intolerance of any ideology that we've seen throughout history. And there's always a small group of people that are keeping the flame alive, that love is the most important thing, that loving others is the most important. So looking at this today, it has real implications. We can see it playing out today in the world, particularly with religion, but as we'll see, it goes beyond religion. There are religions today where people are literally stoned for false doctrine, for false teachings, for being outside the faith, for not converting to the faith. These are ancient ways that religion is exclusive. There's no love. I remember a good example of this when I worked with gay and lesbian youth in the 90s, particularly. I dealt with all these parents who would say to me, they would kick their kids out of their house who are gay and lesbian. And I would talk to the parents like, what's your faith? What's your view of your kids? And they'd say, I have to kick them out because I'm a Christian. So it was my faith. So this false teaching of these doctrines literally led them not to love their kids, to put their kids at risk. This is the example of Cain, the mark of Cain, how Cain plays out today, where you put rules, regulations, you're an insider versus outsiders, and you punish those on the outside, even in your own family. And obviously, this is a very sad photograph taking place in the Middle East right now. Next slide. So throughout the history of the world, we see what happens, particularly with religions, where people get into the idea that they have the truth, and that truth is the most important thing, and I can literally kill you, or I want you to die if you're wrong. It's stunning. 5 million people died in the Crusades, and people were fighting between Christianity and Islam. This is a good example of where Cain's legacy is playing out. They're putting doctrine over love. How could you possibly, in the name of a loving God, murder other faiths? Makes no sense. Next slide, please. Spanish Inquisition executed 30,000 people, and they did it in the name of religious purity. So that's evil. It hides in that kind of, we've got the truth, you're outside the truth, we can other you and eventually kill you. Next slide, please. A lot of people don't know about, in Germany, the 30-year war between Protestants and Catholics, but it was like 8 million people were killed over the idea between Catholics and Protestants, all saying they're followers of Jesus, but we have to kill you because of your view on the Trinity or the Pope or these sort of things. So you can see there's Cain, that mark of Cain, that putting doctrine ahead of love. In the United States, the debates about slavery in the Christian churches justified in the South, justified slavery using scripture. So you can see that it happens all over, and it happens here. It happened, and it led to a civil war where people killed each other over this. Next slide. In Germany, many of the religious leaders used anti-Semitism and hatred of another religion, of the Jews, and they participated. You can see them here shaking the hands of Adolf Hitler, the Lutheran Church. So they were complicit with evil, again, putting these sort of doctrines and rules and earthly focus over top of love. And then just recently, we remembered the 9/11 attacks. That 9/11 attack, the people who did that, many of them were motivated by a religious mission. So it can have a very, very, very dangerous effect. Next slide. And when you hide this within the church, you can have a church that can be very, very much preaching about sexuality and so forth, and it had a blind eye toward child sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church here in the United States. It's kind of unbelievable. Next slide. So Cain explains when we put religious doctrine over compassion and love of others, you can bring about evil and destruction. It starts with contempt. Okay, that's important. When you have contempt for others, and it can lead to violence. Something to be aware of within each of us. Next slide, please. There's a great book, The Brothers Karamazov, and there's a great part of it called The Grand Inquisitor that really, I think, really brings this home for me. And it's a long book to read, The Brothers Karamazov, but you can read The Grand Inquisitor separately, and it's worth it. And it's obviously a movie you could watch. But in this scene, Jesus returns during the Spanish Inquisition, and the cardinal who's running the Inquisition essentially says to Jesus, what you were teaching, this love and compassion and turning the cheek, it was all fine and good, but it's not real. To have real power, to have real control, to really guide people, they need to be punished. You need to be dominant. You need to have control. You need to use violence. Your theory was interesting, but we've perfected it. It's a very powerful scene where they're having a conversation the night before they're going to execute Jesus in the Inquisition. I encourage you to look at it, but it really brings home this idea where you get so into the rules and the doctrines that you forget about the purpose, which is love. So today, now secular groups too, and political groups have also become religious in the way they use fear of others to get them to conform to their views. We don't so much have heresy trials, but we do have cancel culture in the modern version of inquisitions. We have witch hunts, heresy trials. But today it's more likely that if I don't agree with you politically, or you're outside of my viewpoint, I will try to get you, make you lose your career, get you fired. I will share with the public your address. In just ways of punishing. So it's not as much in our secular culture today. That mark of Cain still exists, where we get really into our ideology that we believe is so beautiful and important that we have to destroy other people who disagree with us. Next slide. So Seth, at the very end, I thought was interesting. That little remnant that will always exist in society that loves and teaches inclusion. I think at Church of the Holy City, that's what we would seek to be. We want to be part of the remnant, refuses to give in to contempt. And then again, what you realize is being small, having a small size is not a bad thing. The remnant's always going to be small. The megachurch that might preach intolerance could be carrying Cain's teachings forward of putting doctrine over love. So there needs to be places that always bring forth the message that God is love, and our purpose in life is to learn to love our neighbor. And just the remnant has always been there through history. On the in this photograph, that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, who opposed Hitler and was executed for it. And we know that right now in Iran, you can see, it was just a year ago, I believe it was just a year ago, I think the anniversary was just a few days ago, where a young woman refused to wear a head covering and was killed and led to a revolution. So the remnant can be a very dangerous role of opposing, where you get so into the rules that you forget about humanity, but there's still people who are willing to do it. And I think we're called to that. So that's the question for us today is, will we live in contempt or kindness? It's really the question that our country is facing right now in our politics, where I had an interesting conversation with someone. I'm doing this work on cultural translation. And I was talking to a gentleman recently, and he said, it sounds so naive. It sounds like, more love, more compassion. It sounds kind of hippie. I just don't think it's very realistic. How will it happen? And I said, well, are you willing to give up your contempt for people you disagree with? And he was very honest. He said, no, I'm not ready. I really hate them. I really want them just to die off. I want them to go to jail. I want them punished. I want them destroyed. And my response was, until we as a society get exhausted with that contempt, we will not have kindness. And that contempt that starts out, it starts as comments and thoughts, it starts in our head. We just hate people. It leads to violence. It's a very dangerous spiral. So we're at a critical point in our country right now where we can choose contempt or kindness. We can choose the path of Cain or Abel and Seth. Okay, so ends the lesson.